Hi everybody, it's Courtney and I'm here with another design team project for Not Too Shabby. Today we're going to be creating a one-layer card with the Best Witches stamp set by MFT. So I'm going to start by kind of mapping out my scene here. I have a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock. It's cut down to 5.5 by 4 1/4. And I have a piece of Simon Says stamp masking paper here. And I'm just kind of cutting out a basic shape of what is going to be my road. So I'm going to place this down without taking out the backing or taking off the backing and just lightly tracing that with a pencil. And this will kind of guide me as far as where I need to stamp my images before I actually place down that mask. So I'm going to start off with this little trick-or-treating witch here, and I'm going to stamp her directly on that road, and I'm going to mask her out with that same Simon Says stamp masking paper. You'll see here that I pretty much only cut out her head because I'm not going to be doing any ink blending on the road itself, so I don't need to bother to cut out all of those intricate areas if I don't need to. Going to go ahead and stamp out these two little haunted houses here and also mask those out. And I am stamping with blackout ink by Ink on 3 because it is a Copic safe ink. Now, when you are lining up your masks, you will, when you cut them, want to cut right on that black line. And in order to line them up, sometimes the more simple shaped images or simple shaped stamps are harder to line up. So look for the most intricate area. In this case, it's this little chimney. Line that up first and the rest should fall into place. Don't start with the easiest part to line up because you may have a little trouble once you get to that more intricate area. So for this witch on top, this flying witch here, I'm going to go ahead and stamp her out as well and mask just the right-hand side, because I'm going to also be creating a moon here, and that's going to cover a lot of her up. I did have a little bit of an issue lining this mask up because it is so intricate, but I'll show you how to fix those areas later. I have a piece of the masking paper cut down with a circle die here, and I'm just going to go ahead and place that off to the left-hand side, covering up a little bit of that flying witch. Next, we are going to line up this road again. So I'm taking my scissors just to make sure it's more of a flowy line and I don't have those little jagged edges that I sometimes get. Going to erase my pencil lines because once we do the ink blending and coloring, we won't be able to get rid of those. So I'm going to go ahead and line this up. I want to try to extend this throughout the entire bottom portion of the card panel, but I didn't cut it long enough. But that's all right. We should be able to color right over it. And if not, we can always trim our card panel down. At this point, I'm not starting over. So once that's lined up, we're going to move on to the ink blending here. I am using all Distress Oxides, using Stormy Sky, Faded Jeans, Chipped Sapphire, Seedless Preserves, and Dusty Concord. Using the Trinity Blending Buddy brushes here, and I'm going to start off with the Seedless Preserves towards the bottom of, or the top portion of the road, I guess. It's not all the way to the bottom of my card panel. Next, going on to the Dusty Concord. Then I'll move on to the Stormy Sky, and I'm pretty much only putting this around the moon because I want around the moon to be a little bit lighter of a blue than the rest of the top portion. Then I'll move on to the Faded Jeans and finally the Chipped Sapphire on the top, mainly focusing on the corners because I don't want to get too close to the moon. Now, you'll see here that I'm only using 2 different brushes. A lot of people ask me if I have a different brush for every color. No, I don't. I will use the same brush for the same color family, and I'll just kind of tap that off onto my scrap piece of paper before moving on to the next color. So all the blues, I'm using the same brush, and the 2 purples, I'm using the same brush. You'll also notice here that I didn't get a great blend, and I typically don't the first time around. So I'll work my way up to the top portion of the card panel, and then I'm going to go back in with all of those colors to make sure that they're blending well with the color next to it. The more ink you add, the easier it's going to be to blend. The Distress Oxides don't necessarily seep right into the paper right away. They pretty much sit right on top of it, especially with the more ink you add. So they're very easy to blend even if you don't add any more ink. So sometimes I'll just go in with my brush and kind of get those colors to move a little bit without actually adding any more ink to it. So once I was happy with my blending and the coverage that I got there, I'm going to go ahead and use some shimmer spray. And you want to make sure that you shake this up really, really well. And I usually just take the top off of it and just use that little nozzle or that little tube thing that goes down into the bottle. And I'm just going to spatter this all over my card panel. Now, the closer you get to the card panel, the more control you'll have. I want to add a lot of spatters and I want them to be somewhat close together. So I'm pretty close to the card panel. Gonna let that sit for just a second or two and then just dab that up with a paper towel. I did let my panel sit for about 15 minutes or so before removing my masks because I wanted all of this moisture to kind of dry up, not just from the shimmer spray, but from the Distress Oxides as well. So I'm going to go ahead and carefully remove my masks. I like to take the tip of my scissors to get these started. Even though I did let these sit, the masking paper was still just a teeny tiny bit damp, and you just want to be super careful when you're removing that because it can sometimes tear your paper. So now that that's done, we're going to go ahead and move on to the Copic coloring. So I'm going to start off with my little road here, and this will not be the first time that I color this road because I just was not happy with the results. I still wasn't in the end, honestly, to be happy with the results, but I found a way to kind of cover that up. So I'm going to be using my cool grays here, and I started off with what will be my lightest color just to get the paper saturated a little bit. Next, I'm going in with the C7, and I'm going to go over the darkest areas. So when you're looking at an object, being the road is one single object, the further back it gets from you, the darker it will appear. So I'm concentrating my darkest areas being off to the right-hand side and to the back portion of the road. Next, I'm going to bring in my C5 and I'm going to extend that out a little bit further. Now, the images in this stamp set with these little witches are very teeny tiny. There's a lot of teeny tiny areas on here, and I am going around them, but I'm not overly concerned if I happen to go over the image at all. I can always fix that up with a colorless blender before I color the image, and quite honestly, when you go over something with a gray, especially if it's the C5 or C3, it's really not going to make too much of a difference as long as you're using a color that's a little bit darker than that. So I'm using now the C3 for the part of the road that's, I guess, closer to us. I did also add a shadow underneath her. Anytime you have an image on top of another thing, I guess you could say, you want to make sure that you're creating a shadow to ground that image, or else she's just going to look like she's kind of floating there. So I just used those C7 and C5 markers to create that shadow. Now here you'll see me going back and forth because I just wasn't happy with the results. And even at the end, you're going to see me go back to this road once again. But for now, we're going to kind of leave it the way it is. For this little blank spot here that we have in the front, I wasn't really anticipating this and I didn't really have a plan for it. So I'm bringing in the YG99 and I'm going to fill this area in solid, and this will kind of make it look as if it's grass, but it's nighttime, so it'll be very dark. So I just filled that in solid, and now we will move on to the images themselves. So first, actually, I lie. Her little portion of her hand to the right, no, to the left, but it's her right hand. I didn't mask, but I went over with the Distress Oxides a little bit. So I'm taking a damp paintbrush, dabbing on just a teeny tiny bit of water, letting it sit for a minute or so, and then dabbing that up with a paper towel. You're not going to completely remove it, but you're going to lighten it up enough where you can color over it. So next I'm going to move on to her skin tones, and I'm going to color both of the witches pretty much the same as far as the skin tones go anyway. So I started off with my lightest color to map out the darkest areas. Now for this bottom witch here, the trick-or-treating witch, her shading is going to be off to the left-hand side because she's kind of facing off to the right and the moon is more to the right of her. For this top witch, her shading is going to be off to the right-hand side because the moon is to the left. And that's basically the only light source that we have in this card. So I'm adding a little bit of shading underneath her hair and then off to whatever side I need to. For her little hands and neck, I'm going in solid because it's literally just a dot. So I'm not going to do any shading there. For their hair, for this bottom witch here, I'm going to be using some E50 markers, and I'm only using 3 colors for their hair. I'm just adding a little bit of shading to her little pigtails there where her hair is kind of bunched up and where her bangs are kind of sticking out from underneath her little hat. And I'm just barely touching the tip of the marker to my paper. This is not a huge area to work with. So if you want to try to get multiple colors in there to get your contrast, you want to make sure that your marker is pretty much straight up and down and you're barely touching the paper. So I'm finishing off with the E55 as my highlight color. For this top witch, I didn't want her hair to be exactly the same, so I'm going to be using some E20 markers, but I'm basically doing the same thing. This E29 is going to be my darkest color, which for hair, I like to start with the darkest color because to me, you are able to maintain that texture or maintain those flick lines a little bit easier if you go right in with your darkest color. Just be sure not to overblend and go over the same areas multiple times, or you're going to lose those flick lines anyway. So finishing off with the E21 for my highlight area there for her hair. And next we're going to move on to her outfit and her hat. So for this top witch, I am going to be coloring most of her little outfit and hat purple with the little patches and things green. And then it's going to be opposite or mirrored for the other witch. So like always, starting off with that V01, which is my lightest color, just filling in the darkest areas first to get those mapped out and to get the paper saturated. Next, moving on to the V09. Again, her shading is going to be off to the right-hand side because the moon is off to the left. And I'm just extending that out a little bit. Now, you always want to make sure that if you're not getting the contrast you're looking for, and that's what you are looking for, you want to make sure that you're bringing in a color that is extremely dark, a lot darker than what you want your image to be. And this is a scary color to use. It's the scary dark color to use. But even if you just use a teeny tiny bit of it, you're going to see a huge difference in your coloring. You're going to get that contrast that you're looking for. And it's not really going to change the color of your object. It's just going to give you that contrast. So try to do that. Even if it's just a flick or two, you will definitely notice a difference. So I extended those areas out with the V06, V04, and then I will finish back off with that V01 for my highlight color. Again, this is a lot lighter than my image itself, but again, it allows you to get that contrast. So for her little tights there, I want every other stripe to be purple and green. Again, teeny tiny area, not doing any shading for that. For the greens, I'm going to bring in some YG markers and use a G marker as my darkest color. And for these little areas, you're not really going to notice too much contrast anyway, but you'll see once I move down to the trick-or-treating witch, I'm having a really hard time saying witch today, you'll see that I didn't get the contrast I was looking for and how to go about fixing that. So I'm going to start off with those same greens that I used for the top witch. Again, just starting off with those darkest areas with that lightest color to map those out and to get the paper saturated. And then I'll move into what was going to be my darkest color and add those shadows. Going to pretty much do the same thing as I did for that top witch. I'm just basically switching the light source. So instead of the right, it's going to be off to the left. Now, my darkest color right now is the G17. And at this point, you would think that you're going to get contrast being you're moving on from a G to a YG. And don't get me wrong, I did get contrast. I did get a nice gradient. However, I really like that mega contrast to use that really scary dark color. So once her hat and her little outfit were colored with the same greens that I used for her little patch up on the top, which I'm going to bring in another green even after my coloring is completely done to get that scary dark color. But it doesn't mean you have to recolor that entire image. So once I have this latest color, that YG03 down, I'm going to go ahead and bring in my G29, which is really, really dark. And I'm just going to add a teeny tiny bit of it. And I'm not going to go back in with all of the colors I used. I'm just going to use that lightest mid-tone just to blend it out a little bit, but still maintain that contrast that I'm looking for. And you can see that made a huge, huge difference. Now for her little patch and her little belt, and for every other stripe that she has on her little tights, I'm going to use the same V markers or purple markers that I did for the witch up on top. Again, just using a little teeny tiny bit of that scary dark color to get that contrast. Next, we are going to move on to their, I don't know what you'd call it, the little bands, I guess, and buckles on their hats. So I'm going to want these to appear black. So I'm starting off with my black marker. And because this would be more of a rounder area of this object, I want my highlight to be in the center, but more off towards the light source that we're using. So you'll see that I'm adding a little bit of shading on both sides. However, I'm leaving a little bit more of the highlight on either the left or right side, depending on which it is. Blending that out with the C7, C5, and then I'll finish off with the C3 as my highlight color. And you'll see that these still appear black, but you get that contrast with the grays. Same thing with their shoes, only I'm only using a 3-color blend here because they are so tiny, and I don't want them to blend too much in with the street. Being I'm using the same color combination, I'm just bringing in the black. So I just did a 3-color blend with those. So for their little buckles, I guess you could say, I'm just going to add 1 color to these. These are really teeny tiny, and to get into these teeny tiny areas, you want that marker to be straight up and down and to just barely touch that tip to the paper. So next, I'm going to go ahead and move on to this little pumpkin here. I'm going to saturate the pumpkin with my lightest color and just add a little bit of shading on the top and the bottom. Being this is more of a round object, again, you want a center highlight. Just finishing off with that lightest color right there in the center. And then I'm going to go in and fill in the little jack-o'-lantern's face with just my black marker. I'm not doing any shading to this particular area. Once that was done, we're going to go ahead and move on to the broom of this little flying witch here. And being this is such a small area, I'm going to go right in with my darkest color first. Just going to add a little bit of shading to the bottom portion of the handle, I guess. And then on either side of the broom part itself, because this is kind of like hair. You want to add a little bit of texture to this, and just extending that out with the midtones, finishing up with that lightest color right there in the center. Being I have these colors out, I am going to color this house with that same color combination. Going to start off with that lightest color to get the darkest areas mapped out, and then move on to the darkest color, which is the E39. But to me, as I was adding these colors, the E37 seemed to be a little bit darker than the E39, which was a little strange. The E39 is a new one to my collection, so I wasn't totally used to using it. But I'm adding a little bit of shading underneath the roof from the bottom of the house. And then there's like little bricks that are kind of random in the image. And I'm just adding some shading there just to kind of make those stand out a little bit more and to kind of make it look a little bit, I don't know, spookier, maybe? I don't know. Extending those out with the 2 midtones, and then I'm going to finish off with that E31 and fill that in completely solid. You can see I started going directly over that window. Not really sure what I was thinking, but I'll fix that later. Next, I'm going to bring in the E70 markers for the roof of this house, as well as the main part of the other house. As always, going to start off with that lightest color, especially being these colors that I have here. I think I might be missing one, so I'm jumping from a 79 to a 74, which sometimes doesn't blend all that well. So you want to make sure that your paper is nice and saturated. For the roof, I'm just going to basically add shading from the bottom and concentrating the top portion of the roof with that highlight color. I'm going to use the same color combination for the door as well and shade that pretty much the same way as I did with the roof, just adding a little bit of shading on the bottom of the door and kind of working my way up. I'm also going to use the same E70 combination for the other house, but quite honestly, I did the shading the same exact way, so I skipped through that. And for the roof, I'm going to bring out my E50 markers, doing the shading the same way as I did for that other one, just adding a little bit larger of a highlight off to the left-hand side because that is going to be closer to the moon. Also shading the door the same way as I did for the first house. I did have to take my colorless blender and fix up some of those windows and the little ghosts for the areas that I did go out of the lines just by accident, and some were just stupidity, I guess. And then I am going to take a yellow marker, and quite honestly, I just grabbed one, and I'm going to fill in the windows to make it look as if there is some light coming from the house or houses. Next, we're going to move on to the moon, and my suggestion is that if you are going to color the moon, you do this first because you have to be very careful when going around the image. If you happen to touch the tip of the E40 to that purple area, which is a darker color, you're going to drag that out on your moon. So you have to be super careful. I covered that entire thing up with the E40. Then I'm just going to add some squiggly lines with the E42 just to add a little bit of texture to the moon. And then very quickly go over that with the E40 again, just to kind of get that to blend in a little bit. And here is where I'm still not happy with my road. So the road doesn't meet the houses, first of all. So I took that the C7 to try to get the road to kind of meet those houses, but I'm coloring over distressed oxides, which I don't recommend. You're not going to get the same results, and you're kind of going to get a muddy look. And it looked significantly lighter than it did on just the plain paper. So I'm going to bring in my black marker to add those darker areas to get that road to meet those houses, and that will appear as if it's about the same as the C7 on top of that distress oxides. Then I'm going to bring that C7 down even further than I did the first time around. Same thing with the C5. I'm bringing that down even further. I'm trying to do some flick lines to make these colors blend a little bit easier, but I think I was just, at this point, I'm adding way too much ink, and I'm getting the effects that you get when you overblend, which are not necessarily good. So I'm trying to be careful now to go around the image. Being she's completely covered now, I don't want to have to go around and fix any areas that I go over her with the grays. And I'm going back and forth here, and I'm just not liking it. But at this point, I figured I'm leaving it, and this is where I'm going to place my sentiment. So hopefully it won't be quite as noticeable as it is right now. I'm a little picky when it comes to my own cards for some reason. I think we all are, though, and that's okay. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it for now. But there are some areas around my images where my masks didn't completely line up, either because I didn't cut them good enough or I didn't line them up good enough. So I'm bringing out my Copic chart here, and I'm lining up my card directly next to some of these colors to kind of match them up the best I can. I'm just barely touching the tip of the marker to my paper to fill in these highlight areas, or not the highlight areas, the little outlines that I have. Now, my suggestion is that you use a lighter color first. So if you're kind of between two colors, like which one should I use, start with the lighter color. If you can still see that outline or that halo around your image, then go in with the darkest, because once you add that darkest, you can't take it away. So always start with the lightest of the 2 or 3 options that you think you may have before going in with that darkest color. So here I'm moving on to some V markers, and then I'll bring out an RV marker for that area where that seedless preserves was on the very bottom. And you can do this anytime you're doing masking and ink blending. 99% of the time, I have at least one little area that I have to fix up. In this case, I had a whole lot. So once that was done, we are going to go ahead and move on to my sentiment here. And like I said, I am going to line this up directly on my road, so it's not so noticeable how terrible it is. I don't normally cut my stamps, but in this case, I felt it was just easier to cut the stamp rather than masking a portion of the sentiment off. When I cut my stamps, I do kind of stretch it out with my fingers to make sure I don't cut too much or too far over to one of those letters. I'm going to go ahead and line these up directly onto my road. When I close my MISTI door, I make sure that the grid lines on my MISTI door match up with the sentiment to make sure that my sentiment is completely straight. In this case, it wasn't. So I did have to go back in and kind of fix that up and make sure that they were straight before stamping this with Versamark ink. I did treat this with my anti-static tool first, stamp this out with the Versamark, which is a clear sticky ink that is good for embossing powder. I sprinkled on some white Hero Arts embossing powder, and then I will heat set this with my heat gun. You do want to make sure that your heat gun is heated up before bringing it to the paper. This will minimize the warping that you get. Last, I'm going to go ahead and add some white gel pen details to some of the images, and this will kind of boost up your coloring as well. If you're not all that happy with the coloring, a white gel pen is very inexpensive. Just adding a few little highlights will make it appear as if you have more contrast than you actually do. Last, I'm taking a Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen, and I'm adding shimmer to a whole lot of things because everything is better with a little shimmer. But that is it. That is the card for today. I will leave all of the supplies I used listed below. Do not forget about your discount code to the Not Too Shabby shop. Thanks, guys. Have a great day. Bye.